Welcome to today's webinar, brought to you by OraSure Technologies and Omega Laboratories. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy-to-administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. Oral fluid-based testing products provide a simplified collection process, faster results, cost savings with minimal risk of tampering, and dramatically reduced risk of adulteration. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for drugs of abuse including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, and opiates. With a fast and easy-to-administer collection process, Intercept is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, and clinical setting screening programs, among others. Omega Laboratories is the industry leader in alternative specimen drug testing, including hair and oral fluid analysis, and the only hair laboratory with ISO IEC accreditation. With the ability to provide specimen analysis for clients worldwide, Omega has emerged as a leader in hair and oral fluid analysis industries, providing services for over 4,000 corporate, government, and court-based clients worldwide. With Omega's state-of-the-art facility, it has the capability to perform 2,000 plus tests per day. Omega's ability to perform accurate, timely, and cost-effective testing for clients worldwide keeps them in the forefront. Today's presentation is approved for 1 credit of continuing education from SAPAC for CSAPAs. Further information will be provided at the end of our presentation. Today's presentation is entitled Advanced Forms of Drug Testing, Removing the Pain from Your Drug Testing Program, and will be presented by Bill Current and Brian Drew. Bill Current is the president of WFC & Associates, a national consulting firm that specializes in drug testing, policy development, and providing accurate and up-to-date state drug testing law information. He is the editor of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com. He also publishes the e-newsletter, State Drug Testing Laws Monthly. Mr. Current is the former executive director of the American Council for Drug Education and served as vice president of consulting for a national third-party administrator of drug testing and background screening services. He founded WFC & Associates in 1998. He is the author or co-author of 10 books on substance abuse issues, including Why Drug Testing. He also administers the annual Drug Testing Industry Survey, now in its 16th year. Brian Drew is the current owner and president of Nationwide Medical Review, a company that provides MRO services to employers and TPAs across the United States and in Canada. Under Brian's leadership, NMR has experienced consistent, rapid growth since 2005. Contributing to his success has been Mr. Drew's work with the major SAMHSA laboratories to streamline the electronic import of drug test results. Brian has also developed a proprietary software system designed to securely report results to NMR customers. In 2011, under Mr. Drew's leadership, this software system was launched as a web-based system that meets all federal and state guidelines. He has fully developed expertise in drug and alcohol testing industry, and along with his proven business and financial management skills, have resulted in the enormous success and continued growth. It will now be our pleasure to hear from Bill Current and Brian Drew.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica. And again, we welcome everybody who is on today's webinar. I'm really looking forward to hearing Brian's presentation a little bit later in the hour. And I want to thank OraSure Technologies and Omega Laboratories for co-hosting and co-sponsoring today's webinar. We appreciate the support to bring issues like today's topic to an audience of drug testing providers and those who purchase and use drug testing services. And today we're going to talk about some alternative or advanced testing methods. Now, when we talk about alternative testing methods, we're talking about an alternative to the traditional lab-based urine test, which can, of course, be an accurate and reliable testing method, but I think anybody who's been using urine testing or who sells and manages urine testing programs knows that it is not without its challenges. You've got the drug test cheating issues, you've got all the collection-related issues like shy bladder, securing a restroom, putting blue dye in the toilet water, turning off the hot water, all the things that normally go along with that. They're just, as we say here, a host of other hassles that are sort of part of the urine testing process. And sometimes that can deter employers from even doing drug testing, and in some cases really sort of rob an employer of the full benefits of a testing program. If they feel like it's just a hassle every time we do it, they may be tempted not to do it at all. So you have some advanced testing methods like hair testing and specifically lab-based oral fluid testing that really address those specific issues that are part of, inherent in the urine testing process. And they eliminate most of those hassles, or they reduce the sort of the pain that's part of the traditional urine testing process. That's not to say that urine testing is not good, it's outdated or anything of that nature. It's just that there are alternatives that are available. And sometimes when employers realize that, when they understand the benefits of hair testing, lab-based oral fluid testing, it meets their needs. They find that they can continue to do drug testing, or maybe it's time to adopt a drug testing program because there are alternatives available that really meet their specific needs. Now, I want to clarify something. As we go through today's webinar presentation, I'm going to be talking about lab-based oral fluid testing, not point of collection or instant result oral fluid testing. There's a big difference in the science of those two testing methodologies, and there are going to be some slides coming up where I highlight those differences, but I want to sort of underscore the fact that I'm talking about lab-based oral fluid testing. So the outline for today's presentation, the key points, we'll talk about the magnitude of the drug problem and the need to continue to have workplace drug testing programs. Then I'll talk specifically about lab-based oral fluid testing, then hair testing, sort of what you can expect in terms of accuracy, positivity rates, reliability, etc. And I'm going to sort of just merge those topics into the presentation. So there won't be a specific section that's just about accuracy or just about positivity rates, although I will talk about those things both in the hair testing section and in the oral fluid testing section. But first, let's talk some statistics. I think if you've ever been on one of my webinars, you know I like to start with these statistics because I think it's important to understand and make sure that we're all on the same page that there still is a drug problem in the United States. In fact, it's a growing problem. The trend is heading in the wrong direction. There are nearly 24 million Americans in 2012, the last year that the government gathered data in its annual report. 24 million Americans that admit to being current illicit drug users, meaning they admitted during the survey that they had used an illicit drug at least once in the 30 days prior to being surveyed. And that's Americans 12 and older. That's 9.2% of the population in that age category. And marijuana, not surprisingly, was the most commonly used illicit drug by nearly 19 million users. It was used by 79% of current illicit drug users, and about two-thirds only used marijuana. So it's the drug of choice, and in some cases it's the only drug of choice among people who abuse drugs. 8.9 million persons 12 and older were current users of illicit drugs other than marijuana. So you can see there's a big gap between the marijuana users and the users of other drug categories. Now, when you talk about other drugs, the number 2 category of drug abuse are all the psychotherapeutic drugs gathered together into one category. We're talking about pain relievers, tranquilizers, stimulants, sedatives, all of them together into one category create the number 2 group of drugs, second to marijuana. This chart shows illicit drugs at the top, nearly 24 million. Marijuana, of course, the number 1 drug of abuse in the country, except for alcohol, and that's a completely different presentation. And then below marijuana, in the number 2 slot, psychotherapeutic drugs. Again, the tranquilizers, the sedatives, all of the drugs that go into that prescription drug category. For many years, cocaine was always number 2 to marijuana, but some years back, cocaine started slipping. It's still a problem, especially in certain parts of the country. But the number 2 category of drug abuse are the psychotherapeutic drugs. And that's an important thing to know, because when we talk about having a drug-free workplace, for example, you've got to be testing for the drugs that people are using, or you really are just fooling yourself. So that's an important statistic to know. The rate of current illicit drug use is higher among unemployed Americans than it is among employed Americans when you put it all together, when you put the real numbers all together. but it's still a fairly significant percentage of individuals who have jobs and are working. Now, of the 21.5 million current illicit drug users who are 18 and older, we're talking about adult current illicit drug users, 68% were either employed full or part-time. So among the drug users, a very large percentage of them have jobs. And it really blows away this myth that individuals who use drugs, who are current drug users, can't get a job. They can get a job. There's statistics that show that they change employers 2 or 3 times a year more frequently than their non-using coworkers, but a lot of them do have jobs. There's a lot of people in the workplace who are abusing drugs. So we know the drug problem's going up. We know that a significant percentage of adults who are current illicit drug users have jobs, who are employed either full or part-time. And I think that just simply underscores the importance of having a drug testing program. It then becomes a matter of deciding which testing method is right for you. And so right now, the federal government is in the process of developing regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing to go along with lab-based urine testing. This is a significant development because it's been over 25 years. I mean, it's been a long time since the urine testing regulations were codified, and although there have been changes to those over the years, that's really been the only game in town if you fall under the federal drug testing mandates, like under the U.S. Department of Transportation. Now, for the first time in a long, long time, the government has signaled that they are in the process of developing regs for lab-based oral fluid testing. This is a significant development, and it brings up a lot of questions. There have been a lot of myths about oral fluid testing over the years, and the fact that the federal government's doing this is, in part, why a lot of people are now interested in oral fluid testing. Even though those regulations have not yet come out, they've not been finalized yet, there's already a movement toward lab-based oral fluid testing. I do a survey every year of the drug testing industry, and each year for the last 3 years, we've seen a movement, a slow, steady movement among drug testing providers to at least become knowledgeable on lab-based oral fluid testing, and many of them now starting to offer it, not simply to respond to inquiries about it, but to proactively offer lab-based oral fluid testing. And yet there are some myths, some inaccuracies that exist, and so I'm going to talk about 4 specific ones. Accuracy, the window of detection, its ability to detect marijuana, and then the whole drug test cheating issue. So let's start with accuracy. Now, the presence of drugs in oral fluid, and I'm going to read this statement verbatim, is usually related to the amount of drug in the bloodstream at the time the sample was collected. Oral fluid, and this is an important part of the science of oral fluid testing, oral fluid provides a blood equivalent result. If you talk to any of the scientists, the really smart people in the drug testing industry, they're going to tell you that blood is the gold standard. But of course, it's highly invasive, it's very expensive, impractical. In many states, you're not even allowed to test blood for drugs in a workplace, drug-free workplace program. But oral fluid mimics blood. It's the equivalent of blood in terms of being able to detect drugs in that sample. With an oral fluid sample, you can detect both the parent drug and the metabolite, whereas with urine, you're only going to be able to detect the metabolite. That makes it possible to detect recent drug use more accurately with oral fluid. The window of detection opens up very, very quickly with oral fluid. There's a lag time with urine and a longer lag time with hair testing, but with oral fluid, one of the advantages that's unique to oral fluid, very similar to blood, is that window of detection opens up immediately, and I'm going to show you that in a minute. But the advances in oral fluid testing and the collection technologies are what are making it more accurately, or making it possible to more accurately quantify drug test results. And so when it comes to accuracy, there are certain things, because there are a lot of products and services that are out there right now that are starting to come into play as the federal government develops these regulations. And they're not out yet, so we don't know exactly what they're going to say yet. But if you're looking for a lab-based oral fluid testing program, then whoever's approaching you with it, I always say to my clients, ask them for independent empirical data, some type of peer-reviewed journals that show the results that the seller is claiming. In other words, it can't just be in their marketing literature. It has to be from some type of independent source. Look for clearances and certifications. Is this an FDA-cleared collection device? Are the assays FDA cleared, the drugs that you're testing for in the laboratory? There has to be some type of, a third-party certification that says, yes, this is a product that is equivalent to other products, if not better, and the testing process in the laboratory, same thing. Look for referrals in your industry, in your particular workplace situation. Ask for a list of those. You're going to get their very best, of course, but that can at least lead you to ask questions. How did this work for you? Why did you switch to this? How does it work on a day-to-day basis? And then do your own research. Ask for some products so that you can do your own pilot program. Read the package insert and put it to the test. Go through that package insert and look at all the claims that are made there, and then as you're doing your own internal research with your own pilot program, put it to the test and see if it really does work. And by all means, do your due diligence on who you're doing business with. Are you buying this product directly from the manufacturer? You're doing it through a third party? If it's a third party, who is that person? How long have they been in business? How much do they really know about this? Now, one of the big issues that comes up with oral fluid testing is the window of detection. Is it too short? And I don't think the question is it too short? Because it is a shorter window of detection, generally speaking, than urine testing. It's what can be discovered, what can be learned, what can be detected in that window of detection. The window of detection times start within minutes of ingestion of a drug with oral fluid. Remember, because it's a matter of getting the drug into the bloodstream. And as long as it's in the bloodstream, then it's going to be detectable with that oral fluid sample. So it's going to continue for as long as the drug remains in the bloodstream, okay? Drug detection by oral fluid testing has proven to be as effective as urine testing over comparable periods of time. When it's detectable in oral fluid and when it's detectable in urine, in that period of the window of detection in which the two overlap, they're very, very similar, okay? But every drug has its own unique window of detection, and every specimen, urine, oral fluid, hair, has its own unique ability to reveal the presence of drugs. So let's look at this chart. On the left is where the window of detection starts. And so you'll see red for blood, blue for oral fluid, yellow for urine. The window of detection with blood and oral fluid is right there on top of each other on the far left of the chart. That means that the window of detection opens up almost immediately after an individual has ingested a drug. And you'll see that it goes out for a period of time beyond that initial opening of the window of detection. For blood, it's a little bit shorter than for oral fluid, but oral fluid not as long as urine. But notice on the left side that the window of detection opens up sooner with oral fluid than it does for urine. There's about an hour or so gap between when the window opens up for oral fluid and urine. This makes oral fluid testing ideal for, say, for example, post-accident situations or reasonable suspicion situations. In situations where you suspect somebody just came back from their lunch break and they may be under the influence of marijuana because you smell it on them, or they're acting in some way that's contrary to the prohibited conduct in your drug testing policy. With an oral fluid sample, that window of detection is going to open up almost immediately after the individual has ingested the drug, say on their lunch break out in the parking lot. If you test them right then with oral fluid testing, especially lab-based oral fluid testing, there's a high likelihood that they're going to test positive. With urine, there's going to be a lag time. If it's within that first hour thereabouts when the individual used the drug, if you do it with a urine test, they might not test positive. And so on the front end of the window of detection, you're going to have more positives with oral fluid, and on the back end, you're going to have a few more positives with urine. But in that middle section where the two testing methods overlap in terms of window of detection, it's going to be very similar. And so when you look at the positivity rates of these two side by side, very interestingly, they're very similar. The overall positivity rate, 4.1 for lab-based oral fluid testing, that's that middle column, the intercept column, compared to urinalysis, the urine analysis testing through a laboratory at 4.4%. Now, as you scan down this chart and you look carefully at where the big difference is in terms of positivity rates, you see you've got a higher positivity rate with amphetamine with urine, but then higher methamphetamine with oral fluid, higher with cocaine and oral fluid, on down the list. But look at that fourth one down there, THC. That's the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. 2.5% with lab-based oral fluid testing versus 2.3% with urine testing. Very, very close. But it really sort of blows away this misconception that you cannot detect THC in an oral fluid sample. There's a big difference in the positivity rates of THC in a lab-based oral fluid test versus a POCT or an instant result oral fluid test. But when you look at lab-based oral fluid testing for THC against lab-based urine testing for THC, very similar, even a little bit higher with the lab-based oral fluid testing. Now, the other myth, of course, I've already alluded to it, is can you detect marijuana in an oral fluid sample? And the answer is yes, of course you can, but there's a little bit more to it. Remember, cutoff levels make a big difference, especially when it comes to detecting marijuana. And I've got a chart coming up on that. And also the testing method, lab-based versus POCT, point of collection testing. Lab-based oral fluid testing has a longer window of detection than the current point of collection testing devices for oral fluid that are on the market today. And that's especially true when it comes to marijuana. And that's important because marijuana is the hot topic right now in the workplace when it comes to drug-free workplace programs. So if you're an employer or if you have clients out there who are asking, can I continue to test for marijuana? Well, the answer, of course, is yes, you can, even in the states that have legalized it for medicinal purposes, and even in Colorado and Washington, where it's legalized for recreational purposes. But which testing method you use will have a big effect on the positivity rates. So on this chart, we're looking at cutoff levels along the bottom of the chart. You see that -5 or under 5, that's 5 nanograms per milliliter, all the way, to the far right of the chart. That vertical dotted red line that you see sort of just to the left of the center of the chart, that's the 50 nanogram cutoff level. And so these blue bars represent the positives in each of those different cutoff categories. Less than 5 nanograms, 10 nanograms, less than 20 nanograms, etc. And you can see that the vast majority of the positives, 80%, are below 50 nanograms. And then 20% are to the right. Those are the ones that are above 50 nanograms. And that's typically the detection range of the POCT oral fluid devices that are on the market today. But again, that doesn't mean that that's something wrong or bad about those products. It's just you need to know what you're getting so that your expectations can be met. If you're trying to catch people or get an equivalent percentage of positives for marijuana, for THC, with lab-based with oral fluid testing versus what you had with your old urine testing program, then you need to be testing with lab-based oral fluid testing versus POCT oral fluid because you're going to be able to get more because the cutoff levels with lab-based oral fluid testing are smaller. They're lower, and that's where the majority of the positives are. In fact, most of them are below 20 nanograms per milliliter. That's where the real action is. And so that becomes an important point and something that you want to really suss out in your research when you're comparing lab-based oral fluid testing to POCT oral fluid or traditional urine testing. Now, the last category is drug test cheating. Everybody who's been in drug testing for a long time knows that, cheating on a urine drug test it's a cottage industry. You go onto the internet now, you type in passing a drug test, how to pass a drug test cheating or whatever, even just drug testing, and you're going to get dozens upon dozens upon dozens of websites that offer products, offer advice, offer some type of help for somebody who should not be passing a drug test, who's got drugs in their system, advice on how to pass that drug test, how to cheat the system, because urine testing is susceptible to adulteration, tampering, and substitution. And there's lots of methods to it. This presentation is not about drug test cheating, but that's a serious problem when it comes to urine testing. With oral fluid testing, it's a very, very different game altogether. The oral fluid test, whether you're talking lab-based or instant, is virtually impossible to cheat on. There are now we're starting to see products and advice on how to pass an oral fluid test on the internet, but by comparison, it's almost non-existent compared to urine testing. Every oral fluid collection is observed. The donor and the administrator of the test are standing right in front of each other the entire time that the donor is giving a sample of his or her oral fluid, of their saliva. So the typical testing methods of switching samples, adding something to a sample, etc., just don't work when it comes to oral fluid testing. And the best advice I have ever found on the internet for how to pass an oral fluid test, how to cheat on an oral fluid test, is try to avoid the test. Avoid giving a sample of your saliva. And then as the last paragraph says, between these periods of time, it's talking about the window of detection, you must avoid being screened or you will surely test positive, because there's really no legitimate, proven way to cheat on an oral fluid test. And so when it comes to oral fluid testing, yes, it makes a big difference if drug test cheating is one of your big concerns. Okay, so lots of different industries like oral fluid testing, especially lab-based. Here are some of them now. It's not just in the workplace, of course. It's in criminal justice, treatment, schools, and other non-workplace markets. But lab-based oral fluid testing is starting to really catch on, in part because the federal government's moving in that direction. But there are a lot of advantages to oral fluid testing that really appeal to employers in certain industries. It's legal in almost every state, legally defensible because the science is accurate and it's been proven, and it's a great recent use indicator. All of the collection issues that we could spend an hour talking about, they virtually go away when it comes to lab-based oral fluid testing, the oral fluid testing collection process. Gender matchup between the collector and the donor, the observed collections and whether or not that's permitted, everything that goes along with it. And something that's come up in survey after survey that I've done, it really eliminates the yuck factor that's typically associated with urine testing, especially if you're asking employees to become trained in administering like POCT urine tests. They just don't like dealing with another person's urine, and so that goes away, as well as the whole concern about drug test cheating. Now, let me move a little bit quicker because I want to make sure I leave a lot of time for Brian's part of the presentation. Hair testing is been around since the 1950s. I mean, the technology has been there. It's really only been in the last, say, 25, 30 years that it's become more commonly used for a drug-free workplace test and testing in other markets like criminal justice, for example, and treatment. But this is analyzing a specimen of hair for the presence of illegal drugs, just like other drug testing systems. When a drug is ingested, it enters the bloodstream, it's broken down into specific metabolites. When a hair sample is screened, both the parent drug and the metabolite are isolated. And so any samples that screen as potentially positive can be confirmed in a laboratory with and that's where the hair test takes place, but with a more advanced scientific testing technology, just like with urine and GCMS confirmation testing, the gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. So hair testing has really become a legitimate alternative to traditional urine testing. Now, here's that chart I showed you before. There is a period of days before a drug will be detected in a hair sample. So if the person doesn't use drugs very often, maybe months at a time they don't use it, and they smoke a joint on their lunch break or over the weekend or whatnot, and you test them an hour later or 3 or 4 or 5 days later, it's not going to show up in that hair sample at the cutoff levels that we use. But from about the 7-day mark on, let's just call it a week, thereabouts, give or take a day or two, it's going to show up in the hair. And as you can see to the far right, that window of detection stays open for a long time, in fact, about 90 days. And so it's the longest, widest window of detection of any of the testing methods, which makes it ideal for, say, example, pre-employment drug testing, where you really want to get a good long look at the lifestyle of this individual that you're looking at hiring, or maybe even for random testing. Now, you've got to be concerned about certain things that you hear about hair testing, but a lot of that, just like with lab-based oral fluid testing, really there's no truth to those rumors. The technology, the science of hair testing has really come a long way. The concerns about it being ethnically biased, not really a factor, and the fact that you can't, or the idea that you can't find laboratories that have been certified to conduct hair testing like you can with urine and oral fluid, really, again, not a concern. The science is sound. There have been hundreds and hundreds of studies that have been done and published in peer-reviewed journals that show that hair testing is an accurate medium for detecting drugs in that hair sample. And so you see a lot of companies starting to go to hair testing because they like that technology. And there are some really credible organizations that use hair testing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation laboratories, the U.S. Department of Defense. The United Nations actually published guidelines for testing drugs under international control in hair, sweat, and saliva as far back as 2001. So, 13, 14 years ago, the United Nations was already considering hair testing as a legitimate option available to employers and other entities when it comes to testing for drugs. So there have been really lots and lots of very credible sources showing that hair testing is a viable option. Thousands of tests are conducted throughout the world every day by employers and other organizations, and many employers today recognize hair testing as an accurate and reliable alternative. But it's not just in the workplace. There are a lot of other organizations, entities outside of the workplace, like as you see there in that first bullet, the criminal justice system, school drug testing programs, and others that have turned to hair testing as an alternative. It just is, in some cases, a less invasive collection process, and because that organization, whether it's a workplace or a court or et cetera, they want that broader open window of detection to be able to tell whether the individual's been using drugs. And there's a lot of legal sort of background and credibility with hair testing under some of the most really precise legal examination processes, the Frye Rule, Federal Rules of Evidence, and the Daubert Rule. And you're going to see these as you go through the recording of today's webinar, and you'll have a chance to go back and look at the sources for all of that. Just like with any other testing method, though, a lot depends on the gender of the individual, the size, the weight of the individual, hair color. But it's been found that there is no significant difference between these factors when comparing hair testing with urine and oral fluid testing. So even though these are factors that come into play, there's really no significant difference in these different testing methodologies. Okay? No significant impact based on hair color or ethnicity of the race of the individual. And this has been backed up by the U.S. government going back to 2005. So sometimes you hear that argument, and that's really not a concern. In fact, I have on my bookshelf a book of about 300 pages of just numbers and numbers and numbers of reports on hair testing, and several of them are on that hair color and race issue, essentially debunking any concerns about that. And so that's really not an issue when it comes to hair testing. To make sure that the hair testing process is as clean and streamlined as possible, companies like Omega Laboratories and other organizations have put into place washing procedures and other requirements that are part of various accreditations like the Society of Hair Testing, CAP, the College of American Pathologists, as well as the New York State Department of Health. These are very credible organizations when it comes to certifying laboratories for hair testing. And so when you follow those processes that are part of those accreditations, you have the assurance that the hair test is being done the right way. And with any drug testing method, how you do the drug test is really the most important part. You've got to be following those regulations and guidelines. And a little bit more about that on this chart as well. I'm going to just kind of skip forward just a little bit quickly here so I can get to Brian's part. But there are a number of industries that are very, very high on hair testing, no pun intended. But hair testing is very popular, manufacturing, the oil and gas industry, but also in the trucking industry, which is highly regulated by the Department of Transportation, and yet by their own authority, separate from their compliance with the DOT regs, many trucking companies rely on hair testing, and that's one of the fastest growing market segments for hair testing. Not just in workplace, so as I said, very popular in the gaming industry and schools. A number of federal and state government agencies rely on hair testing. They like that longer window of detection. They like the fact that it's very difficult to adulterate or cheat on a hair test, that the collection sample just does away with all of the concerns when it comes to urine testing. So I know that was a lot all at one time, and I kind of threw it at you in a hurricane there, but you're going to have these slides that you can look at later and go through when you get the link for the recording. Now I'd like to turn the microphone over to Brian Drew from Nationwide Medical Review, who's going to talk more specifically about the perspective from the professional medical review officer.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it, and what a great presentation you had there. I want to take a second to thank OraSure as well and Omega Laboratories for giving us this opportunity to address all you folks, and of course thank everyone for joining us. I've been asked to talk to you today about the MRO perspective of oral fluid and hair testing, specifically after the MRO process. I'm not going to bore you with too many statistics, although there are lots of us in this industry that have these misconceptions of what the real numbers are. I will, again, address some of them in hair and in oral fluid. I'll give you the MRO perspective, at least from the office point of view that we have here. The issues that we find as an MRO office with oral fluid and hair testing, as well as the future of oral fluid testing, as well as hair testing in the industry. So these statistics, urine versus hair. In a DOT urine pre-MRO positive rate of 1.6%, with the general workforce having a 3.5% positivity rate. Again, that is pre-MRO, typically with a 5-panel drug test. These are based on Quest Diagnostics Index in 2012. In our office here, and these are client-specific, one client for each of these statistics. So a state child services agency, post-MRO review of hair has a 45.9% positivity rate, which is just a staggering number. That's equivalent to approximately 7,700 total hair tests in a year. That was last year. For a large trucking company that has added hair testing to their protocol as a pre-employment, their urine positivity rate is 0.65%, with approximately 9,800 total urine tests in 2013. Their hair tests, again, post-MRO review is 5.2%. That is including the expanded opiate testing, which they added in 2013, and that's 8,400 hair tests. Their pre-MRO positivity rate was 7.49%, and mostly the opiates account for that difference in the 5.2 and the 7.49. For the oral fluid side, we have one specific client that does a large number of testing every year. The pre-MRO positivity rate of 7.5%, again with expanded opiates, according to Omega Laboratory statistics, they have a 4.15% positivity after MRO review. And again, opiates account for the majority of those differences. From our perspective as an MRO office, the detection windows of the matrices, hair, urine, and oral fluid, they're just different, as Bill had pointed out. I mean, you've got urine that goes back with specifically marijuana quite a bit further than everything else. But if you look at cocaine and amphetamines, there's really not that much of a difference, except for up front on oral fluid, it grabs that right away, which is a huge plus. The positivity rates can be different as compared to urine as well, as Bill had addressed, so I won't harp on that too long. What's important to us as an MRO and as a medical provider in this field is the level of certainty and that length of detection. With every sample that an MRO talks about with a donor, the level of certainty that's presented to us by the laboratory has to be as close to 100% as possible. And that's why most MROs will not review an instant drug test. It's just impossible to do because it lacks that level of certainty that we look for. The lab-based testing is legally defensible because they use a GCMS or greater, which would be LCMS-MS confirmation test, which again provides us that certainty. In hair, the LEVO isomer of methamphetamine is ruled out, leaving us only the D isomer, which is very helpful. Even in urine testing, it's very difficult to isolate that L and D isomer without an additional test at the laboratory, which can be, as some of you know, a little cost prohibitive. And then also with the hair, you get that 3-month detection window, which, in some cases is not what employers are looking for, but in the trucking industry, they found that detection window has been very helpful in their employment decision-making process. For oral fluid, the lab-based testing, again, is also legally defensible with that GCMS or better testing, which as an MRO, again, like I said, you can't do anything unless it is confirmed by a GCMS or LCMS test. A level of certainty means everything in our business, as it does for everyone out there. You can't make an employment decision based on a positive or negative instant test if you're not 100% sure of the result. On oral fluid, isomer testing may be required, and currently volume can be an issue, not with every device, actually with every device, I shouldn't say. And that all falls back, and I'll point this out on the next slide, to sometimes the collector, and that's all a matter of training in our opinion. The short detection window sounds like a negative point, but it's actually not. As Bill pointed out, you've got that immediate detection, which is just unbelievable in our drug testing world, and most employers are looking for that short window of detection. And again, the only caveat to a detection window or the difference that is between oral fluid and urine is with marijuana. Marijuana does have that longer detection window, and then of course hair goes back to the 3 months. Recent use to some employers means everything, and I think more and more folks nowadays are looking for a test that shows more recent use. Again, the issues with oral fluid and hair, for both hair and oral fluid, the collection errors top our list as an MRO provider. The majority of samples that don't get run are because the collector didn't leave the pad in the mouth long enough or didn't collect enough hair, and again, that typically goes back to the training of the collector. And as I said here, it's mostly a volume issue on both matrices. Bottle B is also a volume issue and can be a problem as well, but I believe the Department of Transportation is working on those regulations to mandate a certain volume. The problem that we have as an MRO is when folks try to compare the results of one testing matrix to another. A negative hair test does not always equal a positive oral fluid test, or a positive urine test doesn't always equal a positive hair test, and vice versa. It is very ill-advised to suggest that they're the same thing. The other issue is that the cutoff levels can be very different from laboratory to laboratory for oral fluids. And again, that's being worked out. It doesn't mean that one laboratory's level is bad or worse than the other, or better for that matter. They all are guarantee the accuracy level of 99.999%, which is important to us. Now, the future of hair and oral fluid in the drug testing market and the DOT market specifically, it will likely be added to the DOT protocol when the DOT decides, or as with everything changing in this DOT program, they say soon. Who knows when that'll be? The standards, they have to be set and mandated for cutoff levels, the device requirements, and collections before these rules can be changed. So it's kind of daunting, and as we all know, nothing in the DOT program happens quickly. Hair testing has not been approved yet by the DOT or DTAB, which is the Drug Testing Advisory Board, but it is rapidly being used within several DOT-mandated industries, as in our case, the FMCSA example we had earlier. Many large trucking companies are doing hair testing under their company policy in addition to their mandatory testing. And Bill, I'm going to give it back to you.
Okay, Brian. Now let me ask you a couple of questions, and let me start out by saying that I was on a webinar. And just go ahead and pass the ball back to me. I was on a webinar a week or two ago. And sometimes the individuals on my presentations are, they may be new to drug testing. They may not have a lot of experience with it. They may not even understand some of the basic terminology, aspects of drug testing. And so one of the questions that was asked that day, and I really don't fault the individual, right? Knowledge is power, so you got to gain it. So the question was, what is an MRO and why should I use an MRO? And I think probably, almost everybody on today's webinar understands that. But my advice to clients is always have a medical review officer as part of your drug testing program. that the MRO's job is to make sure that the lab did its job right, that there are no legitimate explanations for a confirmed positive result. My question to you is, as you go through that process with these alternative testing methods like hair and oral fluid, as you're talking to individuals who have a positive result, and you're trying to sort of get to the bottom and find out, is there a legitimate explanation for this? Are you still hearing, or do you hear some of the same excuses or explanations for why they tested positive in a hair test or an oral fluid test as you traditionally may have heard over the years with urine testing?
Well, for the most part, yes. And it's always the same. I didn't do it. It wasn't me. What we're shocked at is how many mothers are causing their children to be positive. That always gets us. That mom's the smoker, or daddy did it, and I was just in the room. Yes, but the funny thing about hair and oral fluid is that with hair especially, there's a big difference in hair, because when they find out that this detection window goes back 90 days, and in some cases with body hair up to a year, most of the time we do get them to eventually admit use, which is not necessarily the case with urine. I mean, then oral fluid, once you get into the science of the things, and when the MROs are talking to these folks and they tell them point blank, well, the oral fluid device is, within a couple of hours of use, if not minutes, a lot of the times the donors will just finally break down and say, well, yeah, okay, all right, you got me. So there's just a slight difference. I mean, the majority of the time it all starts out with oh, no, it wasn't me. But with these two other matrix, they do change their tune a bit when you get down into the nitty-gritty of the science with them.
So earlier in the presentation I made the statement, and I always try to qualify it to make sure that I'm leaving a little bit of wiggle room for the person in the audience who wants to contradict me, and I always welcome those challenges when I make presentations. But earlier I made the statement that it's virtually impossible. I try to use the word virtually, but virtually impossible to cheat on an oral fluid test, on a hair test. And yet, we are starting to see, websites that offer shampoos or other solutions to cleanse the hair so that the drug doesn't show up in the hair. Are you seeing anything out there that's really working when it comes to these alternative testing methods?
We have had, and of course nothing is a perfect system, but in our, with the volume of drug testing that we do in our office, we have had just a couple a year oral fluid tests that come back. They don't say that they're adulterated because the lab's not testing for adulterants really, but they come back as though it possibly was an oral fluid. And same with hair. Typically with hair, I shouldn't say that. With hair, we don't get any invalids. It's just a matter of insufficient volume. So, when it comes to adulterating, hair is, in our opinion, probably the least possible, followed by oral fluid. And again, we're talking out of tens of thousands of oral fluid tests a year, one or two that people actually get away with it. And I would assert that that's typically a collector issue. If they haven't been trained to wait and make sure the mouth is empty and no drinking, that's the only real way to adulterate an oral fluid sample, is to have something in your mouth.
So when it comes to cheating on drug tests, at least if you're an employer in a particular workplace situation and you're really concerned about it, or it's been a problem for years and you know that people are getting away with it with the traditional urine testing that you're doing, if that's one of your big concerns, then as a medical review officer, you would have no problem, suggesting that they may want to consider lab-based oral fluid testing or hair testing if that's their big issue.
Bill, I literally have that conversation with people every week. Our large employers, our small employers. I had one, as a matter of fact, this morning, and it's interesting that you asked that. I mean, literally, they've had a dilute sample 3 times in a row, and they don't like dilutes, this particular employer. And my suggestion was, well, you either do a hair sample or do an oral fluid test. They can't cheat that. Dilution is not an issue. So we are constantly recommending these alternate matrices.
Now, I heard you during your part of the presentation also talk a little bit about the fact that there's a different, you talked about how you don't like to review POCT results, the instant device results. But I thought I heard you, and I apologize, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I thought I heard you make a statement, sort of comparing the technology or the science of instant oral fluid with lab-based oral fluid testing. Have you found there to be a significant difference in those two technologies?
It's not necessarily the experience, it's the literature. I mean, the lab-based testing is legally defensible 100% of the time. as opposed to an oral fluid or an instant device, POCT device. There's a whole lot of issues with POCT devices, and I always tell folks that they're designed to catch the negatives, not the positives. They're hypersensitive. There's a ton of false positives, and what's unknown to most folks is that there's a lot of false negatives. And as an MRO, because it's a human making the decision of a faint red line, we refuse to acknowledge that it's an accurate result. There's no way we can validate that in court because we physically didn't see it, as opposed to a laboratory-based solution that has 100% defensibility, and that's what it boils down to any employer as well.
Okay. And one of the questions that we were getting here today that I'll let you handle, because you alluded to it during your presentation, is the idea that as the Drug Testing Advisory Board has recommended to SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, that they develop regulations for lab-based oral fluid testing. And so the big question is, we know that's happening. It's in process. It may take a while, but it's in process. But the big question is, when will DOT do that? And I know you mentioned that during your part of the presentation. So nobody has a crystal ball. I know you and I are in many of the same meetings when we have DOT speakers or SAMHSA speakers trying to address that issue. But I'm not aware of any sort of target date for DOT. Are you?
I have not heard it. I don't think they'd issue one until they're ready to give an exact date. It's all just out there floating around, just like the expanded opiate panels out there floating around. And it was 2 years ago that the DOT, with the expanded opiate, said that they're going to fast track it. So if that tells you anything, to look forward to oral fluids. Okay.
Now, one of the questions I get a lot is, what about state drug testing laws? And there are states that have, as part of their drug testing law, they've really sort of punted on all the procedural issues of drug testing. And in the statute in a particular state, it will simply refer to the SAMHSA regulations or to 49 CFR Part 40 and really not provide any more detail or information other than that. And so that's an interesting point, because as it defers to the federal regulations, and in particular Part 40, which today just describes a lab-based urine testing program, once SAMHSA adopts lab-based oral fluid testing, even if DOT hasn't yet, at least at that point in states where employers have by state law been required to follow Part 40, as soon as Part 40 then is modified to include, or revised I should say, to include lab-based oral fluid testing, it would stand to reason that in those states, lab-based oral fluid testing will specifically be permitted, and there won't be that restriction. And in most state laws, it's not really been sort of the general mandatory law that states that. It'll typically be in a state like here in Florida where I live, where we have a voluntary law. But in order to comply with the voluntary law, you have to follow certain procedures and regulations, and usually they'll mirror not DOT, but the SAMHSA regulations. So that question has come up. Another question that has been asked a lot, and maybe, Brian, you and I can both take a stab at this, but one of the individuals is asking, or more than one, asking, how do the costs of one testing method compare to others? And I know we're not really we wouldn't be qualified to give prices, but at least in the cost of say a lab-based urine testing program compared to lab-based oral fluid compared to hair, I'll take a stab at it, and then Brian, you jump in if you'd like. But generally speaking, you're looking at different types of costs. You're looking at the hard dollar cost of drug testing versus the soft dollar cost. And what I mean by that, the hard dollar cost would be, what's the lab charging you? What's the collection charge? If there's a collection charge, what's that? Is there a fee for the medical review officer, or is that bundled in? You're looking at the cost of a lab-based oral fluid analysis versus a lab-based hair analysis versus a lab-based urine analysis. And those prices can be different. A lot of it depends on the volume. A lot of it depends, of course, on, hair versus oral fluid versus urine. But there's also another angle to it, which is the soft dollar cost. What does it cost to send people away from the workplace to a collection site to void a sample of urine, or to have a hair sample taken, or in some cases they may even send them out of the workplace to do an oral fluid sample. But of those three, you can train employees to conduct the oral fluid collection and then package it up, seal it up, and send it to a laboratory for overnight delivery and analysis at the laboratory. And in those cases, those soft dollar costs can be reduced significantly because you're not using a professional technician. That's one thing, of course. That's a hard dollar cost, but you don't have the time away from work that's typically associated with sending an individual to an off-site collection site to provide a urine sample. And that may take an hour, it may take two, it may take a little bit longer. It just depends on the individual, the circumstances, etc. And that's a soft dollar cost that you can sort of put back into your column because you're not actually sending people away for an hour or two. They're simply off the job for 15 minutes or whatever to provide a sample. Does that issue come up? Do people ask you about that as well, Brian?
Yeah, that's the one thing you pointed out was the collection issue, and yes, every one of the clients that the larger clients that do this oral fluid and the hair testing with us, they chose to do it because the lab fees are, as we all know, a little bit more expensive than urine. I think, in my opinion, that's all because of volume. That there's so many labs doing urine testing that the volume is there, they can cut costs in shipping, but they all chose to do their own collections, which saved them a ton of money. So their overall cost, aside from the time off work for the employees, is less than a urine test because they're just paying for the lab. And
Gotcha.
So that's every one of them, all the hair and the oral fluid folks that do it in-house.
Here's another question sent in by a member of our audience, and let me read it, and maybe, Brian, you want to take a stab at it. One concern I have with hair testing is not knowing the level of marijuana use that will trigger a positive. An occasional pot smoker will eventually be identified by a random program using urine or oral fluid testing, but maybe not with hair. Do you find that to be the case?
Well, there's limits to all the testing. Even with urine, you run the risk of the same pot smoker adulterating the sample or diluting it so much that it doesn't, you don't get an accurate result. That is an issue with hair. You're not going to get the recent use, and depending on how experienced the collector is, if they cut the hair too far away from the scalp, you're missing that initial first 30 days or first 15 days. So we do hear that. We get calls all the time because a urine test was positive and a hair test was negative, and people are just very confused about that. It is an issue, but no more of an issue than the folks cheating on the urine test.
Okay. And what about, here's another question sent in. Can you explain the detection limits for THC and lab-based oral fluid testing? I think perhaps what he's talking about maybe are the cutoff levels. Does that sound right? Can you repeat the detection limit? Maybe it's the window of detection that he's referring to. If that's the case, let me just go back to this slide that shows the window of detection for oral fluid. And I apologize to our audience member if this is not what you were asking for. Please clarify it for us. But you can see the window of detection with blood and oral fluid. Those are the two testing methods that open up immediately so that you see that window of detection on the far left with blood and oral fluid. That means that, all the way over to the left like that means that the drug is going to be detectable in a blood or oral fluid sample almost immediately after the individual has ingested the drug. And then it's going to go out for a period of time to the right there, not as far out as urine does, of course, and not as far out as hair, of course, but it opens up sooner on the left side, sooner to the time that the individual used the drug. And that's why I said earlier that oral fluid testing is an ideal testing method for post-accident or reasonable suspicion, where you suspect somebody is under the influence of drugs right now. They maybe, like I said, have just come back from a lunch break and maybe they smoked a joint out in the parking lot. They're going to test positive, most likely, in an oral fluid test as opposed to a urine test if you're testing them, say, within an hour after they come back from their lunch break, if that's what you suspect had happened. And I hope that was the question that was being asked there. Also, the other question was comparing the difference between POCT oral fluid and POCT urine. Do you have any experience or opinions on that one, Brian?
Well, I'd be hard-pressed to give you answers on the positivity and negativity rates of POCT. Live statistics, because we don't ever see the point of contact results, point of collection results, that is. So the package inserts of those devices say that it's somewhere around 97% accurate on the negatives. But if you also look at the drugs that can interfere with an instant test, there's just so many of them that will give you a false positive. So again, I don't really know accurate statistics, but I can assume that 97 to 98% accuracy is pretty darn good.
Yeah, and actually, to take it one step further, if you're comparing, say, POCT oral fluid with lab-based oral fluid testing, there's going to be a significant difference there as well. And also, just a clarification on the cutoff levels for THC. With the POCT devices that are in the market today, you're going to be somewhere 40 nanograms per milliliter or higher typically, as opposed to lab-based oral fluid testing, which is going to be, closer to the 5 nanograms, give or take a little bit there. So that's why when you look at that detection chart that I had up, where I compared the different positivity rates for detecting THC in oral fluid, that's why you saw so many blue bars on the left of the red dotted line, because that's where the majority of the THC positives are going to be at. They're going to be at those lower cutoff levels. This is the chart I was referring to earlier, whereas most of the POCT oral fluid devices are going to be to the right of that 50 nanogram per milliliter cutoff level category. Anyways, we have more questions, but we've run out of time. Let me first just thank Brian Drew for co-presenting with me today. Great job, Brian. And also thanks again to OraSure Technologies and to Omega Laboratories for co-sponsoring today's webinar. And with that, I'll turn the microphone back over to Jessica.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Brian. On behalf of OraSure Technologies, we hope you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording. Today's presentation is approved for 1 credit hour of continuing education from SAPAC for CSAPAs. Please email Jessica Polt, that's me, at jessica@billcurrent.com. Again, that's Jessica, JESSICA, @billcurrent, BILLCURRENT.com if you are interested in receiving that credit. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.